black lights and booze burn when I record for Watts. And every black like Troy Davis who never had a fair shot. All black, everything.
Welcome to Left in Black. My name is Sasha Panaram, and I'm a graduate student in the Department of English at Duke. And today we are joined by Professor Randi Gill-Sadler, an assistant professor of English at Lafayette College. Welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
I want to begin our conversation by talking a little bit about what brings you to Durham and to Duke. So later tonight you're going to be on a panel called New Directions in Black Transnational and Diaspora Studies, organized by Professor Jarvis C. McInnes, an assistant professor of English. And the event itself is being sponsored by the Representing Migration Humanities Lab, which itself is sponsored and supported by the Humanities Unbounded program at Duke. By way of introduction, tell us a little bit about what you work on within the discipline of English and how you came to that.
Okay. Within the discipline of English, I work largely on 20th century Black women's travel narratives. I'm particularly interested in travel narratives as well as Black women's migrations in the Caribbean during the context of various U.S. imperial exploits in the region. So I've looked at work looking at Black women traveling during and after the occupation of Haiti, as well as the invasion of Grenada, as well as, various neo-colonial economic plans and shifts within the region. And I'm really looking for the ways these Black women express a desire for diasporic connections, but in their travel and their narrative are reckoning with some of the tensions that come from their proximity to U.S. empire via their status as citizens in the United States.
You were so kind to share your paper with me in advance of the talk tonight, and I'm really looking forward to hearing you present it. So you're going to be talking a bit about June Jordan
Yes.
and her travels in the Bahamas.
Yes.
And what's interesting about the work that you shared with me, so you talk about June Jordan, you talk about particularly the report from the Bahamas.
Yes.
You read that up and against the note that she receives from the Ministry of Tourism.
Yes.
And then you read that against what you find in Essence magazine
Yes.
and the advertisements
Yes.
about travels to the Caribbean. Talk a little bit more about what it means to read all three of those things, very, very distinct forms
Right.
against one another. And also, why is literature important
Right.
in this? So why literature for what you want to say?
So I really kind of came to my work on June Jordan via Paule Marshall's work. So thinking about a novel like Praise Song for the Widow and thinking about tourism and Black Americans as tourists and travelers, particularly within the multinational tourist industry. And so it was kind of dealing with the tensions of Praise Song of the Widow that brought me to June Jordan's work. And what I found and what I really enjoy about June Jordan, outside of just how phenomenal a poet and essayist she is, she wrote across so many different genres and venues. So one of the things that I didn't mention in the talk, but that I've done in my research, is that June Jordan frequently contributed pieces to Essence magazine. That was a place where she was sharing her work, where she was putting forth ideas, particularly ideas about more radical forms of diasporic relationality. So she has a piece in the 80s called Black People and Foreign Policy that she publishes in Essence, where she's really calling on an interracial, transnational, anti-colonial diasporic formation to happen, using the metaphor of the world as a plantation. And so she is already engaged with that audience, engaged with that publication. But what I found to be so kind of ironic is you would have a piece like that in Essence, and then maybe 5 pages later, you would have the It's Better in the Bahamas tourism advertisement that is kind of, and very much in tension with the previous piece, June Jordan's piece. So to me, in some ways, the connection between Black women's writing and Essence really kind of occurs naturally. I truly follow Black women, not just their travels abroad, but travel their publication history. Where are these pieces going? Where are they coming from? And so to me, what I try to do in reading the advertisements with actual travel literature and essays is just show what the advertisements obscure. So there's a certain narrative of Black consumption, Black pleasure, and even Black freedom that's being attempted to be communicated in these advertisements as liberatory. But I find that they also obscure the exploited labor of non-U.S. Black folks who have to make that leisure possible. And so for me, reading the ads and reading them alongside literature creates a more robust conversation that really deals with the kind of structural issues that are creating both the exploited labor in the Caribbean, but also these kind of narratives of leisure and consumption within a publication like Essence Magazine.
I feel like Essence is having a revival moment insofar, especially in the academy. I know so many different people who are returning to it as this rich source, the archival material that, as you say, it's how do we, if we track these publications, what can we then pull out from them? And it's fantastic to then see that work emerge in this place,
Absolutely. And I think the thing to me about Essence is my relationship with Essence is both academic, but it's also personal. You know, I grew up with the Essence magazines in the bathroom, kitchen table. So part of it for me is also really kind of dealing with the ways that Essence has been treated as a publication that's very much interested in the kind of Black middle class bourgeois ethic. But when you go back, especially in the 70s and 80s, it's a lot more complicated what's going on. And you have, you know, radical feminists like June Jordan, like Audre Lorde, like Angela Davis, who frequently appear in that venue. And I think it says something too about just the type of scholars and intellectuals they were, to situate their work in that platform and the type of audiences that they were trying to engage. So,
definitely. Yeah. I want to talk about Paule Marshall, but we're going to bracket this, but I've got to mark it for myself. The fact that that novel starts on a boat, like we're already thrown into this space of transportation, an interesting one that she then tries to remove herself from. But let's talk a little bit more about June Jordan.
Okay.
So you do this reading of when she's in the market space, and she's starting to bump up against, you know, not just her, but Black and white tourists are bumping up, literally jostling is the word that you focus on. And what I'm interested is in that moment right after that, when she says, I'm in the market because I'm buying stuff that I want to go take home for my family and friends. And you know, this is a moment that she's anticipating her return and what she's going to take back. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about Brooklyn. You know, I know your work is thinking about Black transnational relationships and how she's negotiating Blackness when she's in the Bahamas. What happens when she comes back stateside? You could talk about her specifically, or more generally, what are the conversations that we're able to have stateside that we perhaps can't have, like, or she can't have while she's there?
Yeah, I think, you know, June Jordan is so self-reflective and self-critical, even throughout that essay. So while she's thinking about her time in the Caribbean, as you pointed out, she's, you know, thinking forward about when she gets back. But she's also reflecting about how her relationships with these Black women in the Caribbean are shedding light on other relationships that she has, relationships with her students, relationships with colleagues, where she's suspecting that there should be some sense of connection, there should be some sense of solidarity on the basis of, you know, race, gender, etc. And she's finding that those categories don't hold. And what those categories mean for connection, you know, is very precarious. And so I think thinking about that essay, but then also thinking about other essays that follow reports from the Bahamas. So her work that she did on traveling to Nicaragua, also a lot of her work on political issues in Lebanon. I see her really trying to think through, you know, what does it mean to be in solidarity with people both in your community as well as abroad, but also how does one kind of develop an anti-colonial politics in a place like Brooklyn, right? In a place like New York City that is very diasporic in some ways, but also New York City writ large being a kind of center for U.S. imperialism. And so I think in her kind of returning stateside, she's trying to reckon with how to deal with these questions that have been kind of prompted by her experience in the Caribbean. and how to move forward with those both as an essayist and as a poet.
What's interesting about the time period that you're working in, the 80s, so not only are these women, these Black women novelists and artists, willingly traveling there, they're going in coalitions.
Yes.
There are entire groups
Yes.
that are then sponsored. And
Yes.
it's just an interesting moment to think about sort of the type of exchange that can
Absolutely.
happen when you are being invited to
Absolutely.
a space. I was thinking about Cuba recently, and there's Audre Lorde, there's
Yes.
June Jordan, there's Alexis DeVoe, there's
Yes.
Toni Cade Bambara.
Yes.
I mean, all these wonderful, fantastic, very prolific Black women
Yes.
are going into that space. Talk about those coalitions, and does that, of course it emerges in your work.
Yes.
Talk about how.
So the trip to Cuba that you're speaking about, that was sponsored by the Black Scholar in '85.
Yes.
It's something that definitely comes up in my project. And one of the reasons it comes up for me is I'm thinking about the 50s and 60s, how you had a lot of state sponsors or U.S. sponsored trips for figures like a Louis Armstrong, right, who was supposed to go all around the world and
Right.
perform.
Yes.
And part of, the desire to have him do this is to kind of create or perpetuate this narrative, right, that the U.S. has overcome, right, Jim Crow segregation, it's overcome racism, and these kind of traveling Black artists and intellectuals are supposed to be evidence of that. So for me to look at travel in the 80s, we kind of see a pushing back against that. So we see Black feminists traveling individually to figure out what's actually happened in Nicaragua, what's happened in Grenada. But we also see some of those same, Black arts presses, right, sponsoring Black women going and sharing their work in places like
Right.
Cuba, and also bringing Afro-Cuban women to the United States to share their work. So for me, it really comes up as a moment where I think people are trying to reckon with both the Black Power movement, civil rights movement, but also this very strong imperial thrust in the 80s, where Reagan is clearly trying to consolidate power throughout the entire hemisphere. And so for me, these independent traveling Black women, as well as these coalitions of Black women traveling, are really trying to illuminate that first, right? To say, like, U.S. imperialism is definitely still happening and still a worthy concern for everyone, but also trying to kind of rebuild and continue some of those connections that have been made transnationally from previous eras.
It's great to hear you talk about that. And this is an excellent point to sort of return to Paule Marshall, I think. So I've been working on her as part of my own dissertation, so it's just fun to have someone to chat about.
I always
this
love to
stuff
talk about
with.
Paule Marshall.
Yes, great. And one of the things, I feel like she's known for, say, praise songs. She's known for brownstones, brown girls. But she's not necessarily, she's written so much, like her speeches and her short stories. There's just so much, I think, that falls out of the picture when we think about her. And I'm reminded, as you talk about Louis Armstrong's travel, the way that Langston Hughes sort of took her under his wings and said, "You're coming with me. We're going abroad. We're going to France. We're going to be there. We're going to be everywhere." And sort of that was her way into her own Black literary tradition. And sort of it makes me think about the way that people, again, to speak to what you've just said, the importance of both the independent travel, but then also the coalition, and then where you are at the right moment, the right time, things of that nature too. All the stars need to sometimes align, and for her it very much did.
And I think Paule Marshall is someone whose literary career has been so long and spanned so many decades that there's so much there. So yes, it's the travel with Langston Hughes, but it's also her participation in the Harlem Writers Guild as well. And when we think about the kind of political messages in that literary group's work, to me, she just really kind of comes to the forefront, like you said, a lot with her short stories as well, where you're kind of seeing this back and forth travel between the Caribbean, as well as to the United States again, whether to places like Brooklyn or to places like South Carolina. I just think the way that she's mapping diaspora in her work, but also dealing with the very real tensions and asymmetries that are inherent in diaspora is just super important. Yeah.
And she very much revises her own work in a certain sense, you know, that short story Merle, or, you know, there are certain figures that I think start to appear the closer you read her work, and it gets, again, to what you're saying, there's a complexity to what she's trying to describe, and she can never do it in just one place.
No, not at all.
You know, and she's always going to return and take us back
to
that moment and help us think that through again. So I want to shift this a little bit. I know that when you were in graduate school, you were part of an oral history project.
Yes.
And from what I understand, you were interviewing Floridians, is that correct?
Yes.
Yeah, so trying to capture histories that might have otherwise been lost.
Yes.
And I also know that you had a chance to interview Nikki Giovanni.
I did, yes, I did.
It's fantastic, and I watched that just recently. So talk about that process and sort of what capturing oral history has done for the work, the literary work that you do.
Doing oral histories was so intense at first. I think part of being a literary scholar that I liked is there's a lot of control, right? You get the text, you read the text, I interpret it, it's my reading. There's a certain element of control, and there's a certain amount of reliability. I know the text will be there, I can refer back to it. And, you know, when you're doing oral histories, you know, the interviewee may show up an hour late, they may not want to answer questions that you ask. But I think that's also something that's extremely intimate about sitting down with someone, and we did life history. So when you're sitting down with someone and you're saying, talk to me about your childhood, and they go from their childhood into their, you know, adult life, some of the interviewees being 60 and 70 years old. That's a lot to take in 2 hours. So it's a very different experience as far as research methodology for me, with how I had traditionally been doing research as a literary scholar. One of the figures that I really came to admire even more through that process was someone like Azor Neale Hurston, who was doing that kind of interdisciplinarity, mixed method work, who's, you know, writing but also interviewing people. We had a chance to interview people actually in Eatonville, Florida, you know, where Zora kind of grew up, and to just talk about what her impact is still in that community. But you really come to admire someone like her who is doing that kind of interpersonal work and developing those relationships, but then also the care that she takes with those lives, the way she then represents them in text. And I think for me, it just helped me realize the stakes of the work I was doing in a very real, embodied way. So when you're thinking about how you're theorizing about U.S. imperialism or anti-Blackness or, you know, the Cold War period, and you're dealing with people who have lived it, it's a different kind of accountability that you recognize that your work, you know, has to have, and what it has to mean outside of some of just the kind of requirements of being a scholar or being an academic. So, yeah.
No, it's such important work.
Very important work.
I'm very glad to hear you speak to that, and that you had the chance to do that, because I think it's something, if available and if an option, more people should find ways to do those types of projects.
Absolutely.
I want to shift this again. So I think if I did my research right, you are a LeBron James fan?
Yes, I'm a big LeBron James fan, yes. So I love LeBron.
I should tell you that I'm not. I feel like I need to mark
that's
that.
Unfortunate.
It's all right. We pick our battles. No,
you picked the losing one, but that's all right.
No, I'm a Tim Duncan kind of guy.
Okay.
Let's talk
I get that.
Well, let's bring it back. So, any thoughts about what he's doing with the I Promise schools?
You know, I think what LeBron is doing, I just have so much respect and admiration for LeBron James, because I think we don't always recognize, you know, LeBron James has been in the spotlight since he's been 14 years old. You know, he's a child star for all intents and purposes. And I think the way that he's trying to give back to the community, the ways that he's trying to speak out about social justice issues, I think is super important. And, you know, do I think LeBron James is the most radical figure on the earth? No. But I also think there's something to be said for people who are attempting to kind of gain that type of consciousness, people who are, you know, attempting to take care of communities, take care of children, provide opportunities for them, especially in these political times where we see just outright negligence on the part of the state. You know, so I hope that that's something that goes well. I hope that that's something that is around for a long time to come. Yeah.
Last question.
Yes.
I know that this is not your first visit to Duke. You were here for the CIPA program. So
Yes.
tell us what that program is and your participation in it.
So CIPA is a 2-year mentoring program that Duke hosts, and so you apply and explain like 2 types of projects you would like to complete related to your teaching or your research. And if you are chosen, then they match you with a mentor outside of your respective institution, but someone that's at a similar institution. So if you're at a private liberal arts college, you're matched with someone else at a similar institution. And so we did a 3-day workshop in August where all the fellows came and all the mentors came, and we just got an opportunity to not only meet each other, but to have workshops from some of the mentors as well as some of the Duke faculty about various parts of the academic journey. So we talked about, you know, how do you market yourself or describe your work if you're an interdisciplinary scholar? How do you manage your social media presence as a scholar? How to develop a teaching portfolio or research agenda? And that was just super important. I really enjoyed that experience, just to be in a space with people who are both similarly situated in their career, but also to have all the mentors and all the Duke faculty who were super supportive and kind and generous, and just to have that space to kind of think about your career, think about your research, and just the time to plan with intention as opposed to with kind of some of the pressing deadlines or pressing schedule of teaching and research. Just to have that kind of 3 days to think about how you want to move forward for the next 2 years was super helpful.
What a rich space to be a part of.
Very rich, yes.
We've been joined today by Professor Randi Gill-Sadler. She's an assistant professor of English at Lafayette College. Thanks so much for talking with me today.
Thank you.
Black lights and booze burn when I record for Watts, and every black like Troy Davis who never